Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
A man that is very studied and quite the scholar of another form of radio is Dr. Brian Rosenwald. Brian Rosenwald is one of the most knowledgeable people on the subject of talk radio that there is. He is a political and media historian par excellence and understands the nexus between the worlds of politics and media better than anybody. He's also the author of the book Talk Radio's America, and apparently he even knows a thing or two about baseball. Brian, it is great to talk with you. Even better when the Mets are just a victory away from not only eliminating the Philadelphia Phillies, but advancing to the National League Championship Series.
Frank, you guys are causing me pain here. My beloved Phillies look terrible, and it's all because of the good at-bats that the Mets are having inning after inning after inning. You know, we've used 7 relievers in this series, and you've scored on all 7 of them.
You know, I must say, Brian, I am a little surprised that you're a Phillies fan. And look, I have my closest friend from childhood, Anthony Magliocca, is a Phillies fan. My cousin Andrea, who lives in Philadelphia now, she's a Phillies fan. But you seem like such a nice guy. And everything that I've seen from these Phillies fans is just so incredibly classless. I don't understand how they were booing Brandon Nimmo when he got into a collision and might have gotten hurt the other day. I mean, why do Phillies fans behave the way that they do?
Well, first of all, I think there's a duality to our fan base. You know, we're the city that gave Trey Turner a standing ovation and turned his season around last year after being terrible for 4 months as a big money free agent. We have a softer side to us, but when it comes to our rival teams, we tend to have a hard edge, in part, I think, because all we've done is suffer. Frank, I'm 41 years old. I've seen 2 championships across 4 major sports in 41 years. Our record, if you look at the 4 Philadelphia teams' records in the conference finals or league championship series or World Series or championship series, it's abysmal. You know, I have not seen a Stanley Cup or an NBA championship, unless you count the Sixers 83 championship, which either happened a couple of weeks before I was born or right around when I was born. So we suffer from futility.
Got it. So the Philly fans are a little bit embittered. That's what leads to that kind of raucous fandom.
I think so, and I also think that it you know, as we saw with the Dodgers the other night, it takes only a few bad apples to make an entire fan base look bad and boorish. And, you know, I think every fan base has them, and we certainly have our idiots, but I don't know that it's unique. And I think, you know, a lot of our guys now like playing here, which wasn't always the case, because they love that the fans care that this is ripping our guts out.
Well, I'm looking forward to going to the game today. I'm told that my seats are somewhere in the vicinity of home plate. I'm going to hold up a copy of your book, and who knows, maybe if the Phillies take the lead, I might burn it live on television. We'll see how that goes. You know, one of the things that was interesting, though, about this postseason picture, so many exciting games, not only as we've seen in the Mets-Phillies series, but all of the series, the Padres-Dodgers, the Royals-Yankees, the Detroit and Cleveland, they all started tied 1-1. It's almost like they're scripting this to have this be the most dramatic possible outcome of each series.
Well, first of all, I think that, you know, that there's a lot of parity in baseball. It's not the only sport that has that, but there's a lot of parity, especially this year. There was no great juggernaut. And by the time you got to this round, the differences between these teams was relatively small. You know, the Mets were better than the Phillies from like June 1st onward. So, you know, there weren't huge gaps there. And I also think that the other thing is in the playoffs, they have all these off days. And what do the off days do? they mean that depth is less important. And usually the biggest difference in baseball between the best teams and the good but not great teams is they have a much deeper roster. Well, that doesn't matter in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, if you don't have a good fourth starter or fifth starter, it doesn't matter anymore. Or if your fifth reliever isn't very good. So I think that the format forces, kind of makes this more exciting, even if it's not necessarily fair to the best teams over the long haul of the season. Now, if I were commissioner, and nobody wants to make me commissioner, Frank, but if I was, I'd probably take some of these off days out so that it gave an advantage to the better teams.
It's interesting to me that the Dodgers are also only one game away from elimination. I didn't see that coming necessarily either.
No, and I mean, they got a grand slam in the third inning with one out tonight to get back within one run, and then had one hit after that. I think that the other thing that you see here is there's a lot of pressure from expectation. The fan bases in Philadelphia and L.A. basically said championship or bust, whereas I think the fans in San Diego and Mets fans were just kind of thrilled to get here and have a shot at it.
Right.
And I think that that the guys aren't gripping their bats as tight. They're playing with a looseness and an energy that the Phillies did this 2 years ago. But now all of a sudden it's championship or bust, and I think players start to kind of grip the bats too tight, and all of a sudden they come up small.
My last question about this, and then I want to pick your brain on one or two other items. You've spent a lot of time analyzing media bias. You've talked about how talk radio emerged as a largely conservative medium because of all of the inherent liberal bias that was present in all of the other media. I'm watching the Fox Sports 1 coverage of this Phillies Mets series. I have to tell you, I find the media aspect of this just atrocious. They covered the introductions of the Phillies players, and yet the first Met playoff game at home in 18 years or something, or at least since the World Series in 2015, they don't cover the coverage of the Mets introductions. I'm watching the Phillies bat, and I think it was, I don't remember if it was Turner. Yeah, it was Turner who was unhappy with the call, and he looks back at the umpire, basically arguing balls and strikes, and the announcer says, "Oh, he's unhappy with the call. Understandably so." Excuse me. What? We're now having the announcers side with the players on their disputes over the umpire? I got to tell you, I'm finding a tremendous amount of bias in the coverage of this Phillies-Mets series.
Well, first of all, I found Adam Wainwright almost unlistenable. Half the time I'm like, well, you just said the same thing that he asked you a question, and now you've repeated the question. What have I learned from you talking here incessantly? But I also think that there's something deeper here. Baseball is a sport that for 162 games, for 6 months, almost every day, you listen to local announcers who have their fingers on the pulse of a community. I mean, one way that I became a diehard Phillies fan is listening to the late, great Harry Callis on the radio laying in bed as a kid.
Right. Same thing with me and Bob Murphy as a Met fan.
Exactly. So we're used to the kind of homer announcer. And I think that national broadcasters, first of all, that face a kind of impossible task because one fan base or the other is usually pissed at them. And the second thing is, what I find even more annoying is that they don't really know the teams that well.
Right.
They try to get their research in, but it's all shallow. They get so much wrong. And I don't know what the answer is because, other sports, they let the first round of the playoffs, you can have local announcers calling it. Football, of course, is all national on television. But I really haven't been impressed. And the other thing that has struck me, Frank, is that there really isn't that seminal national baseball announced team the way you've had it in other sports. There is no Mike Breen, to use a guy with New York roots.
Right. No John Madden and Pat Summerall. Right. No Al Michaels.
Doc Emmerich,
even. Yeah.
Al Michaels, people like that. There's none of that. And so I think it's kind of this, it rotates different guys every year, and none of them leave me particularly impressed. They're not bad, but they're certainly not great. And it's just a weird experience after listening to, the home team announcers who are openly rooting for your team for 6 months. And now you've got these guys who kind of try to parachute in, don't know as much about the teams, are trying to be objective, whatever that looks like. And they don't pull it off particularly well.
Now, let me pick your brain a little bit on the election and political talk radio. I kind of became a fan of talk radio in general because I would go to bed with my transistor radio listening to the Mets and the Yankees, and then I'd wake up hearing all of these bombastic talk personalities. One of the questions that I'm sure you get every day, and when I meet someone, I get the question frequently, I even get it frequently on the air, is why is talk radio such a conservative medium? Now, for a lot of people over the last 25 years or so that have said, well, it's not exactly a conservative medium. Look at the biggest talk radio host that there is, Howard Stern. He's not a conservative necessarily. Before we talk about Howard's behavior in this election and how he's covered this election, what do you always say? And what have you historically said to that argument of, oh, no, talk radio is not a conservative medium because of Howard Stern?
Well, I've said two things. The first is that political talk radio was always conservative, in part because there were other programs, radio programs, that appealed to liberal listeners. You had NPR for the kind of well-educated liberal, the college plus voter, so to speak, who's got at least one advanced degree, sometimes more. They like to listen to NPR. At one point, Morning Edition was the top-rated show in all of radio. Then you had Howard Stern and what was called in the industry guy talk. And what ended up happening with a bunch of guys, Tom Likas out in L.A., Howard Stern, I think, to some extent, although a little bit less so, and a bunch of other guys, is they saw the writing on the wall in the late 80s, early 90s, that political talk was going conservative. It hadn't always been that way, but the rise and the success of Rush Limbaugh and then the rise and success of the first all-conservative stations in Seattle and San Francisco had convinced the people programming stations that being conservative was the key to success. So you had a guy like Likas who had actually been on Rush's station in L.A. doing a kind of liberal or even, times libertarian-y political thing, said, you know what, I'm going to get into raunch, and I'm going to talk about sex, and I'm going to talk about this kind of stuff because I can't make it in politics with my views. I'm not going to get on the air. I'm going to lose my gig. And so he followed the pathway of Howard Stern. So, I think Howard quite understandably realized, look, I've got my own lane here. And it was much less political. And I think, 20, 30 years ago, Howard Stern was a kind of mix of liberal positions, conservative positions, libertarian positions. I think it was 94 that he famously sided with the Republicans and had an impact in New York on races. And I think he's gotten much more liberal over time. But even now, he's not all that political. He'd rather talk to Bruce Springsteen or Billy Joel or, Eddie Vedder and do that for an hour. He's not bringing on a parade of political guests.
So in over the last 2, 3, 4 years, Howard has definitely become increasingly more political. He did that interview with President Biden, and it wasn't as if he had President Biden in what he used to call the homo room or anything like that. He had Kamala Harris on yesterday. In both of those, and the same thing when he had Andrew Cuomo on earlier, in both of those interviews, the Biden interview and the Harris interview, it almost was like almost an infomercial. I mean, Howard has a very non-confrontational style, but one of the things that's made him such an interesting interviewer and such a great interviewer is because with that style of his, he's able to get people to say things that they would never say. My sense in listening to, I didn't hear all of it, but most of Harris on Stern yesterday, he was amplifying points that she hadn't made, and there was no even pretext of a challenging question. Here's a little bit of Kamala Harris on with Howard Stern yesterday.
Why are you eating for breakfast Raisin Bran? I read. I feel there's a lot of sugar.
So I don't eat Raisin Bran every morning, but if you asked me what was my favorite cereal, I would put it right up there with, and now this is going to be obnoxious, and Special K.
Special K is...
Well, it's really great. Plus, my mother used to make these Special K cookies, in honor of me.
Can you imagine if your mother was alive and saw her daughter running for president of the United States?
I miss her every day.
She was something, huh?
Yeah, she was very special. All 5 feet of her. You would have loved her. If you met her, you would have thought she was 6 feet tall.
When she worked in a chemical lab and she worked on developing cures for breast cancer.
Correct.
You would go with her as a little girl
and
clean the test tubes.
That was my first job.
With respect, Brian, Howard in this interview with Kamala Harris made Bill Whitaker look like Bill O'Reilly in terms of hard-hitting questions in the 60 Minutes interview. I mean, I think it's safe to say that Howard, at least in this election, has firmly come down on the anti-Trump, pro-Harris side of the world, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I thought after his interview with Biden earlier in the year that he was making Democratic talking points, or he was voicing Democratic talking points much more strongly than Democrats do. And I think he did some of that again with Harris. The difference, and I actually think you're seeing the difference between the two parties' kind of media bases in the last couple of days. Harris is doing forums like Howard Stern, like the Call Her Daddy podcast, that are not political every day, not political in every episode. They may occasionally dip their toes into politics, or they may talk about issues that are political without talking about, horse race politics, but they're not everyday politics. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has been on with Ben Shapiro and Hugh Hewitt and conservative talkers who, if you listen to them every day, their shows are much more political than not. And I think that that's the difference, is that talk radio, political talk radio developed into a conservative bastion, whereas Howard Stern absolutely leans left and has weighed in. But if you listen to him every show, I wonder, my guess is he's talking a lot less politics than does, say, Hugh Hewitt or Ben Shapiro.
Well, that's no question about that. No question about that.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by Factor. Optimize your nutrition this year with Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal service. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved, ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from 40 weekly options across 8 dietary preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Eat smarter at factormeals.com/listen50 and use code listen50 for 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Factormeals.com/listen50, code listen50. T's and C's apply.
Hey besties, listen up. I have a secret to tell you. LinkedIn now has improved the job search experience for nurses. Search by your specialty, the shifts you want to work, and the salary that you want to make. With so many employers hiring on LinkedIn, finding the perfect job is even more simplified. So don't spend months searching. Go to linkedin.com/nurses and find out why in the past year, more than 1.5 million nurses have used LinkedIn to search for their next role. That's linkedin.com/nurses.
Do you think that the fact that Howard has such a heavy audience among men could actually sway the outcome of this election?
I think that's what Harris is doing this week, Frank. She, Call Her Daddy was targeting young women. The View was targeting middle-aged and older women. Howard was targeting men. Howard was trying to say, look, I know I'm going to lose men, especially white men, but if I can cut that deficit just a little bit, just a couple of points, especially with younger men who Harris is struggling with, that could be the difference in the election. And so I think that Howard was a kind of sympathetic forum where she could reach men who may be more culturally liberal, at least, even if they might be economically more conservative, where she could reach them and appear human to them and maybe make some inroads. She's not trying to win that demographic, but if she can lose them by 2 or 3 points less, that could be enough in a close election.
Brian, I wish I had more time and we hadn't spent so much time with our Phillies-Mets feud. But can you explain to me briefly why anyone spends any time, if you're a president, talking to Bob Woodward? You know it's not going to look good for you.
I don't get it at this point. I mean, I don't get a lot of the leak kind of stuff anymore, Frank. It's like, why did you Biden said something to a friend who's then going to go gab to Bob Woodward? People have big mouths. People want attention from reporters, especially a guy like Woodward, who, let's face it, is a legend. And I just don't get a lot of this stuff where people are doing harm to their party, they're doing harm to their side by leaking stuff or by talking to reporters for things that they know can't possibly make them and their co-partisans look good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Brian Rosenwald, if you have not yet purchased his book, Talk Radio's America, it is an absolute must-read if you're interested in the medium. Thank you, Brian.
Always a pleasure, Frank. Great talking with you.
Good luck. Hopefully I'll wave it to you from behind home plate tonight. Appreciate it. Brian Rosenwald. If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, you could do so at 646-720-0635. That's 1-646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.